Welcome back, boys, to another video. This time something a little bit different because I actually want to talk about a news topic, which arguably is no longer news. What I'm going to talk about here happened a couple of weeks ago already, but I want to dive a little bit into the topic of Jean Pormanove and his death. Jean Pormanove was a French cake streamer who died during a stream marathon, which I believe was intended to go 10 days, and he died on day 8 or something like that due to health complications, I think has so far been the conclusion of his autopsy. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with this whole situation, with what happened, Jean Pormanove, again, was a streamer. I believe he was streaming with a group of people. And generally, these guys made different kinds of content, but what they were most known for were some pretty extreme physical challenges, where this guy, Jean Pormanove, who ended up dying, would get beat up, choked, all kinds of different sort of physical brutality essentially was enacted upon him. You know, there would be challenges set, goals to be met in regards to donations, this type of thing, to essentially do certain things on stream to this guy. Now, how voluntary this actually was and to which extent this guy was manipulated and essentially abused by the other people he was streaming with, because he was the only guy undertaking these challenges. He was the guy getting beat up, all of these types of things. That is somewhat questionable. I've seen people say that he seems to have been somewhat mentally challenged. He also had some health issues prior to this whole thing that he was going into this whole streaming situation with. And the guys he was working with, quote unquote, the guys he was streaming with here, do seem to have had some sinister intentions, or at the very least, they were not exactly on the same exact page as he was. So, long story short, to kind of summarize the facts here, if you do want to know more about this, there's plenty of, again, news articles, YouTube videos, all this kind of stuff surrounding this whole case that you can go look at. Very briefly summarizing the whole situation, you got a group of guys who are enacting these brutal challenges, again, beatings, choking, this type of stuff, on stream, live, being incentivized essentially by the people watching, paying for this type of stuff, donating to see this type of stuff. All of these things are being done to one person out of this group. So we don't have a bunch of guys who are just a little bit crazy and doing this shit to each other. You got a group of people who were also noticeably younger and do seem in full possession of their mental capabilities, doing this to one guy, and this guy ends up dying, right? Now, as far as I know, he did not die due to any injuries sustained from beatings, that type of thing. But the circumstances of his death, I think, are not entirely, there's not a clear answer yet. The authorities are not satisfied. There's still an investigation that's ongoing, essentially. Now, the reason I wanted to talk about this topic, even though this is not usually the type of video I make, is because it kind of connects to some of the things I speak about on this channel. What I find very interesting about this whole situation, and it's not necessarily unique to this case, but in this situation it highlights some interesting things about our society and about the way people react to these cases. What I find very interesting here is the general response, right? Both from authorities and also people just reacting to this online, being outraged, being disgusted, shocked by something like this happening on a streaming site live, essentially a guy just dying on camera. And not just suddenly dying under mysterious circumstances. Again, the circumstances of this death, I believe, as far as the authorities go, are not entirely solved. There's still an investigation. But I think it's very clear that you have a lot of brutality, you have a lot of physical and psychological stress going on. And this was going on for a pretty significant amount of time. So even if he hadn't died in this situation, something like that, a death or a severe injury, was definitely something you could have predicted by looking at what was going on, I think. And the general reaction to situations like this that challenge the sort of core values, the core principles of modern Western society to some extent, is usually, yes, outrage, but a very specific type of outrage that I would almost categorize as a sort of medieval peasant mob kind of mentality. And that is the desire to look for and find someone who can be held accountable. This could be a specific person, a specific individual. This could be a group of people, an institution. At the end of the day, the general reaction to situations like this tends to be who is at fault here in a very immediate kind of sense. And this doesn't just go for people, private individuals reacting to this stuff in comments and that type of thing. This also kind of goes for the reaction of authorities and media in general. So in this case here, we have a reaction that is very focused on one hand on the individuals that did these challenges with, or perhaps more accurately, to Jean Pormanove, and also to kind of lay the blame on Kick, the streaming platform. And just right off the bat, I want to say that there's nothing inherently wrong with that. Yes, I think in a very immediate sense, it does make sense to look for blame in these places. But what I do find very interesting here is that the sort of surrounding circumstances in a much grander, more general sense are kind of left out of the picture to a pretty significant extent, in my opinion. What I have not seen a lot of talk about is the question of how did something like this end up happening in the first place, and not in relation to, Kick has to monitor this type of stuff more intently, or, these guys were evil, they were psychopaths, or whatever. I think what's being ignored to a very significant extent is the fact that at the end of the day, a huge part of this whole situation was the fact that these guys were being incentivized by random people watching this content, paying for this real brutality being enacted. And at the end of the day, something bad ends up happening. And sure, you can look at a situation like that and say, if Kick didn't allow this type of content, that wouldn't have happened. But I think that's a little bit short-sighted, honestly. You can hold Kick accountable as a platform for allowing this type of content at all. But at the end of the day, if we're being honest with ourselves, if Kick didn't, do we really think there wouldn't have been another platform that would pop up that would allow content like this to still exist? If Kick didn't allow this to happen, would that have prevented this situation? And would that have prevented situations like this in a more general sense? I think the answer is no, because the problem lies a lot deeper. And I think a similar kind of perspective can be taken when it comes to the guys who did this, or in my opinion, at least were very clearly deeply involved in this end result. Even if they didn't directly kill this guy, I think it's very clear that the entire situation they engineered led to his death. Sure, you can blame these guys immediately. Sure, you can say they are evil people, they make evil choices. Or you can take the route of saying there's something wrong with their brain chemistry, right? They have something wrong with them sort of physiologically, or maybe they have psychological trauma or whatever. Whether you want to lay blame on these people as individuals or say that there's something wrong with them on a psychological, physiological level, whatever, I think this as well is a very short-sighted perspective. If these specific guys hadn't been there, or if these specific guys had been apprehended before this happened, would that have prevented this specific situation? Perhaps, but stuff like this happening in general? I don't think so, right? And I think it's a very natural response to look at situations like this in a very immediate sort of context and very immediately try to lay blame or very immediately try to look for causes. But again, it kind of ignores the reality of how something like this could come to exist in a civilization, in a society like ours in the first place. And I think that's perhaps food for thought with situations like this. Sure, we can lay blame, we can look for culprits to assign immediate responsibility for this specific situation to, but does that prevent things like this in the future? Maybe in a very direct sense, these specific guys, for example, if they go to prison, will not be able to do something like that again. This specific platform will not allow something like this to be shown on their platform again. But is that the core of what's going on here? I think this goes a lot deeper, and that's why I wanted to talk about this topic. I've been yapping, kind of building up to the point I want to make here for a bit now. So what the fuck am I getting at? The reason I wanted to address this situation, the reason I wanted to point this out and kind of talk about it, is because I think it reveals a fundamental issue with our society, with our value system, and with the way we view humans in general. Our society, to a very significant extent, is built on Christian values, on Christian ideals that have been translated into a non-religious context with, things like human rights, that sort of thing. But even humanism, which tries to, be a secular kind of value system, if you look at the core of what humanism is, those are Christian values, essentially. It's a question of good and evil. And the kind of society that results from that is a society where aspects of humanity are suppressed or are called evil, are called negative. They are looked down upon. They are perhaps even persecuted, made criminal offenses. But doing that doesn't really deal with the fact that certain impulses, certain drives live within us that do not adhere to this good and evil dichotomy or don't care about it. Okay? Are the people who did this potentially a little out of whack psychologically? Sure, that is very possible. But I don't think it is necessarily relevant. I don't think it is actually important, because I think a situation like this could have happened with people who are psychologically sound. and who were just incentivized enough by the reinforcement they received from viewers through donations, messages, etc., to enact something like this. And I think what that comes down to really is a fundamental suppression of core aspects of humanity in our society, to the point where they are basically denied, or when they rear their ugly head, they are regarded as malformed. This guy had psychological issues, or this institution didn't properly monitor what was going on under their own roof, that type of thing. What people feel kind of uncomfortable with, I think, is accepting the fact that, yes, you can look for immediate things that went wrong. You can look for immediate things that may or may not be wrong with this or that person. But the truth is that these things didn't happen because something immediately went wrong. The truth is that situations like this arise, that things like this happen, because we live in a society that fundamentally denies that an inherent brutality is part of humans, especially men, when it comes to physical violence. And sure, you can outlaw that. Sure, you can try to fight that. Sure, you can make that criminal. But perhaps you should also ask yourself the question whether or not a society, a civilization that denies these realities is even well set up in the first place. And I think the fact that these urges being suppressed doesn't mean they go away is incredibly obvious if you just look at popular media. Even if you look at the kinds of movies, TV shows, etc., that have been produced over the last couple of decades, 10, 20, 30 years, you see a lot of very explicit brutality, gore, sexually explicit content in, some pretty brutal contexts as well. You got like a lot of scenes in adult TV shows, that type of stuff. So clearly, people are intrigued and fascinated by these things. And for some people, watching movies, watching content like this can be an outlet. But I think in the same way that watching porn doesn't really compensate for a lack of actual physical intimacy with another human being, watching brutal movies, watching gory, violent movies and TV shows doesn't necessarily compensate for this physical drive that people carry inside them. And so beyond sort of immediate circumstances that surround situations like this, I think it's very important to look at the general societal context and the way in which urges like this are ignored, pushed into the darkness of the sort of general societal subconscious. Both individuals are pushing this stuff into the subconscious, and in a sense, the entire society as a whole is kind of relegating these things they don't want to deal with to the darkness of, this is just bad, this is evil, which I believe leads eventually to a pretty substantial disconnect between what humans actually are and what the average person thinks a human is and should be. And then you see people reacting to these kinds of situations in an incredibly shocked, sort of dramatic manner, where they're like, how could something like this happen? That sort of thing. And this is not to take away from whether or not a situation is tragic, right? Whether or not what happened in a situation like this is sad and has a negative effect on people. But I think what should be a lot more shocking about cases like this is the fact that people are surprised by things like this happening at all, right? Not that something like this would happen, that people are surprised by the fact that people under the right circumstances, with the right incentives, and perhaps with some of the right psychological predetermining factors for something like this, would do this. That should not be surprising. That should not be shocking. Brutality is a very inherent part of human nature. And instead of just looking for immediate solutions to problems, not just when it comes to violence, this also goes for other things that arise from human drives and impulses, I think we should question whether or not all aspects of humanity are in some way, shape, or form properly integrated into our conception of a society, which I don't think is the case at all in the West. A lot of things are just forbidden or are just outlawed, and for the moment being, that might be a sort of okay solution to some problems, but people are violent. People have violence inside them. And if there's no proper outlet for that, sooner or later, you are going to have people who are a little bit more violent and a little bit more willing to push the boundaries than others. And these people are going to result in situations like this. Now, I'm not going to sit here and pretend like I have some kind of immediate solution to this. I think going off of previous videos, a lot of you probably know that there are a lot of very fundamental issues I see with Western society. So this is just another symptom of a much deeper problem, I think, generally that the West has nowadays, where we have followed a value system that has gotten us to a certain point, but is now going too far into a direction where it is just becoming delusional. But one of the things I do want to point out is that actual physical altercation in a somewhat controlled, somewhat supervised, monitored context is not a central, fundamental part of Western society, certainly not of many Western countries. Martial arts, combat sports, that type of thing is not a part of standard school curriculums. And there are countries where you can't even take a martial arts class if that's what you choose to do. So in most Western countries, you will not engage with any form of combat sport, with any form of martial art, with any sort of physical altercation in that sense, learning how to fight, but also learning how strong you are in relation to other people, learning to properly fight other people, learning how easily perhaps other people are hurt as well, and also at the very base level, just having a somewhat more controlled outlet for actual, real physical violence to an extent, right? The ability to engage in this with other people. You just don't have that as part of growing up, going from a child to an adult, unless you specifically choose a class like this or you engage in something like this outside of school, right? You just sign up for a club, a gym, a dojo, what have you. And this is not to say that people who practice martial arts, who practice combat sports, who learn how to fight, in general will never commit violence. But what I do see is that a lot of people I have met, I've interacted with, who train in martial arts are a lot more balanced just in regards to their personality as a whole. They are a lot more chill, a lot more confident. They feel less of a need to kind of put down others in a physical sense outside of their martial arts training, because even just subconsciously, they have an outlet for these types of urges and drives in the training setting. And I think if some form of fighting, something like wrestling, boxing, judo, something like this, if that was a fundamental part, a base component of physical education, of sports in schools, there would be a much more significant level of understanding and respect when it comes to physical violence in general, because people would just be a little bit more in touch with what that actually means. And they would also be significantly less curious, perhaps, about brutality, because it has not been relegated to essentially the shadow realm of our civilization. But this is just one immediate thought that came to mind as I was recording this. I just wanted to address this topic, talk about this situation a little bit to kind of give my immediate thought that I had in relation to this happening, which again is that I find it very interesting that people generally look for very immediate causes, very immediate parties to be blamed, to be made accountable for what happened, as opposed to maybe thinking about stuff like this happening somewhat deeper, questioning perhaps the civilization they live in general, and the practices of this civilization when it comes to suppressing certain urges, certain parts of humanity. That's actually going to be it for this video. Just a quick random rant on this topic. If you guys enjoyed yourselves, found this interesting, maybe were inspired to think about these types of situations, these types of topics a little bit deeper on a slightly more profound level, perhaps, go ahead and leave a like down below. Now, one of the ways in which you can get in touch more with your human nature is, of course, physical training. If you're interested in building a primal physique, a body of the gods, really working on your strength, your vitality, that type of thing, reconnecting with a more instinctual way of living inside your body and going through life, go ahead and check out the Primal Physique course down below, a comprehensive course that goes into everything you need to build a new age barbarian body that is going to be strong, healthy, all around physically capable. Course is very comprehensive, but also very dense. So you're not going to be sitting there listening to me for 6 hours just yapping about shit. Very condensed, very cut down to the essentials. You'll be getting a lot of bang for your buck. If you're interested in this type of thing, nutrition, training progression, habits outside of training, all that good stuff, go ahead, check out the course down below. I've also uploaded some of my current programs to Ko-fi, which is where the course is as well. So if you're interested in supporting this channel, but you don't believe in charity, you actually want to get something back for the couple of bucks you want to give me to support my work, you can go ahead and grab a program. I've got stuff for muscle growth. I've got a program focused more on power, on explosive strength, and a program for strength endurance if you kind of want to work on your conditioning, round out your physique. So I think there's something for everyone there. And again, if you want to support the channel, you can get something back in return for that. Just head over to Ko-fi, and for a few bucks, you can grab one of these programs. And then finally, if you're interested in a more personalized approach, perhaps you already have built a pretty decent physique, perhaps you just want to take this whole thing a little bit more seriously, and so you want a personal coach to help you with that, or you want a personalized training program that is perfectly adapted to your lifestyle. You've maybe trained on different programs by YouTubers, coaches, whatever in the past, but now you want something that really feels like you, that is actually perfectly tapered to your wants and needs, to your athletic goals. Perhaps if you train in some sport or you have a specific physique in mind. In any case, if that's something you're looking for, go ahead and hit me up either on Ko-fi again, or you can shoot me a DM on Instagram. We can talk about all kinds of things, more general questions, specific stuff. I can make a program for you. I can work with you on a nutrition plan. So yeah, if you're interested in that, just go ahead, hit me up, and we can get started on your training progress. If you want to see more videos of mine in the future, go ahead and subscribe. I usually make content on more fitness related topics in a very holistic sense though. So I do talk about training, but also general health aspects and practical philosophy. If you're interested in that type of stuff, again, go ahead and subscribe and activate the notification bell, as always, if you want notifications. That's going to be it. Feel free to leave a comment down below if you've got something to say or just want to push the algorithm a little bit, help the channel out. I'll see you guys in the next one. And until then, have a good one.